Yes, your supreme divinity, it shall be as you say. You stupid, pompous excuse for an overlord, Calandrian added silently, careful to veil his mind from his master's telepathic probing. And what of came the rumbling hiss, cutting him off. After a moment's silence, the Garnet Overlord added, Do not speak her foul name. His voice was a sibilant whisper, yet it carried across the vast mountainous cavern. The soft, menacing sound echoed back and forth between the bare, magically reinforced stone walls, bouncing off massive mounds of gold and silver and reflecting from piles of gems and jewels. It rang in the hollows of numerous stacks of ancient human-sized weapons and armor. My apologies, Master, Calandrian said, lowering his triangular blue-scaled head and long arching neck to within inches of the cavern floor, in the draconic form of prostration. He dared not raise an eye while his master was this volatile. It is not yet time, Kel thought, his impatience rising. Soon we will rise against him en masse, but the slightest show of disloyalty now alone, and he will vaporize me in an instant. He felt the heat of the Overlord's gaze upon him. The air tingled with the intensity of his ire. It was true. He had nearly broken sacred law, but was this really necessary? To Calandrian, being forced into the painful, degrading pose for even a few minutes was punishment enough. Why did the beast have to make him maintain it for so long? He spent hours with his nose to the floor, though such a time was hardly measurable to the more ancient worms of his savage world. To Kel, it was eternity. At length the Garnet Overlord, Gravin Nastayur, deigned to speak again. You are forgiven, little Kel. I know your young mind forgets my decrees so easily. Now, see to my commands, and when you return, bring my traitorous daughter's servant, Brinthiala. I require entertainment of the female variety for the evening. His deep voice held all the weight of the stone around them and carried magnificently echoing throughout the cavern. Calandrian seethed in silent rage. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, and he bowed down further, scraping the scales of his jaw against the cavern floor to cover the sound of his claws gouging the stone and his sharp teeth grinding together. He hoped the Overlord didn't notice. He kept his eyes lowered, certain his fury would be obvious, while bowing and scraping several more times. He formed the ritual words, Your will, my claws, your divinity, then turned from the Overlord and waddled from the cavern. His scales trembled in rage. Kel would have preferred to fly from his master's presence, and only just stopped himself from flaring his wings out from his sides in frustration. Now is not the time to provoke him. In better spirits, I could likely get away with it, but not today. Calandrian supposed the bloated garnet beast thought it some sort of an affront to his power and authority to allow other worms to fly inside his lair, that it somehow demeaned his status as Overlord. Self-conscious human nonsense of the worst kind, Kel thought in derision. He found himself despising the Overlord all the more. As if it's possible to hate the fat bastard more, Kel thought bitterly as he limped toward the only entrance to the Overlord's massive lair chamber. Kel hated walking. His forelegs were small, misshapen, and weak. On the ground, his limping gait was awkward and clumsy, nearly as slow as an average human. But relative to other dragons, he moved at a snail's pace. If I could kill her again, and again, and again, I would do it, he thought. That wretched lizard bitch. May her soul rot in the bowels of the earth forever. Calandrian wanted with all his being to turn around and spew all the venomous indignation he felt at his master, to release his frustration and his rage, to let go his fury, his terror, his pain, and his sorrow. Too much is at stake, he thought. Gravin Nastayur could destroy us in an instant. and will do so, of course, at the first hint of betrayal. He wasn't ready to die, but worse than death was failure. Dying now would be of no use, he thought. Not to anyone. Calandrian had grown adept at masking his thoughts from the Overlord over the decades since he and his cohorts began planning the insurrection against the massive Garnet. Most of the time it came as second nature, but thinking such things in close proximity to the Overlord still made him nervous, especially when his emotions were raging, like now. There had been several times already when he had inadvertently revealed information, which would have meant his end if the Overlord had understood the context or the subtext. He cut off the thought and built up his mental wall. 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 5, 6, in. 4, 7, 8, 5, 9, 10, 6, 11, 12, out. 7, 13, 14, 8, 15, 16, 9, 17, 18, in. 10, 19, 20, 11, 21, 22, 12, 23, 24, out. Kel had long ago found that directing his every conscious thought to his breathing and his steps was a powerful mental defense. It took nearly an hour to reach the entryway of the lair proper, a distance that would have taken an average dragon of his size just a few minutes, and Graven Nastayur himself only a few seconds, or but an instant if he took to the air. He crossed the entryway into a massive corridor and spent more than 3 hours traversing its snaking length. At the mouth of the corridor, leading into the miles-wide entry cavern, Kel had to stop to rest. His cramping forelegs needed a chance to recuperate. As he always did, he stared in awe at the artwork that graced the floor and walls of the massive cavern, which dwarfed the huge chamber at the heart of the tunnels. Its walls were covered with intricate carvings. The floor was a masterpiece of uncounted, some said uncountable, colored marble slabs decorated with inlays of nearly every known metal, precious and otherwise. They formed a mural which displayed a huge natural cavern with rich veins of ores and minerals in the walls, all in striking three-dimensional detail. Within the cavern, a council comprising members of every draconic species on Earth, some of them extinct, were gathered in worshipful prostration around a massive platinum altar, on which lay a majestic garnet dragon, its scales a deeper, bloodier red than any modern dragon Kel had ever heard of. It dwarfed any dragon he had ever seen, including the great bulk of Graven Nastayur and the other overlords. "Don't think too much of yourself, do you?" Kel thought as he slammed his massive azure tail on the glossy stone beneath his feet. He typically reserved the silent symbol of rebellion for when he crossed over the massive garnet worm displayed in the mural, but his emotions were still bubbling over from the confrontation with the Overlord. It was all he could do not to roar in fury and leap into the air, forsaking the sacred command prohibiting flight within the confines of the Overlord's lair. Gritting his teeth, Calandrian started the long trek through the entry cavern, making his way toward the cool, fresh mountain air of the outside world, away from the stifling, sulphurous stench of the Overlord. Glancing around, as he always did during his travails through the entry cavern, Kel found himself both pleased and awed by the carvings adorning the walls and ceiling. Thousands upon thousands of scenes depicting the history of their ancient savage world. The panoramic images began to the right of the entrance as one entered, with the story of the dinosaurs. As one traversed around the curving inner wall, the pictorial history continued. The middle of the story came at the entrance to the tunnel leading to Graven Nastayur's lair, showing the first modern contact between dragons and humans, which ushered in the Dragon Wars and the Age of Extinction. Finally, at the left of the entrance, the story came to an end with the cessation of violence between dragons, leading to the event supposedly depicted on the cavern floor, an event which would for all time be praised by dragons everywhere. The council which brought an end to the Age of Extinction. The details were not known, but somehow every surviving dragon was brought together in relative peace for a grand council of dragons. Grauvenostayur maintained it was his sire whom organized and officiated the council, as the mural on the floor indicated, but no others lent their voice to his claim. Of course, Calandrian reflected in annoyance as he crossed the threshold to the open mountain air. There aren't many others who claim to be old enough to have been there. Not that who was responsible for it makes much difference anymore. It certainly doesn't change that we are about to completely throw the scales to the wind and disregard the number one rule that was established at the end of the Age of Extinction. Even if we win, what's going to happen to us when the other overlords find out? The crippled azurite dragon, a colossal beast in his own right, though utterly dwarfed by his overlord, stepped through the immense cave mouth and took a deep breath of the cold mountain air. It was blissfully clean, containing no trace of his master's sulphurous scent. Calandrian forced his breath from his lungs and reared up on his hind legs. He held the pose, his muscles bunched powerfully, then pushed with all his might against the rocks in a mighty leap. At its pinnacle, several wingspans above the cave entrance, he spread his leathery aqua wings and let the rising thermals push him aloft, gliding southward with the wind. His breath caught in his throat, his awe undiminished by the wind stinging his eyes, and the sound of it fluttering the backs of his wings was beautiful music. His heart beat furiously, surging dark blood through his veins to thunder in his ears. Within the rapturous ecstasy, he scarcely noticed the white-capped mountains shimmering in the bright golden sunlight beneath him, their blue-gray slopes and jagged clefts, or the profusion of green flowering trees near the base of the mountain. The details registered somewhere in the back of his mind, but consciously he was aware only of the exhilaration of flight. Later, when his ecstasy cooled, he wondered at the experience. It had always been that way, of course, but how was it that even now, more than a millennium after the crippling of his forelegs, he still asked the question, how can a thing so clumsy on the ground be so graceful in the air? Injury or no, he was unable to wrap his mind around the idea that being utterly debilitated on the ground had no effect on his grace in flight. Yet even with his questioning, his joy was undeniable. By Calandrian's own reckoning, his journey ended much too quickly. He considered flying around the earth before stopping, but the fleeting thought died the moment it was born. This meeting is too important for such frivolity, he thought. He scarcely noticed passing the Wormtail, a long, vaguely tail-shaped stretch of land with sea on three sides. He then crossed the Sea of Fire, a small body of water to the south which separated Grauvenostayur's realm from that of Coriothaliast, the Azurite overlord whom controlled the southern continent. A short way inland from the northern coast was his destination. He was far beyond the reach of his master's domain, far beyond the reach of any errand his master would send him on. If news of my coming here reaches him before we are ready to strike, my life is forfeit,